Noir plasma chrome bleed. Unlocking knowledge, inspiring innovation, empowering curious minds.
This website makes learning so easy. I found all my resources here.
Like what you share.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to our latest explainer. Today, we are tracking over 15 centuries of British literature. Now, it's super easy to think of literary history as just, a dusty, linear timeline of old books. But what we're actually going to explore today is that the evolution of British literature is a fascinating, continuous dialogue of disruption. It's really a story of reactive shifts, where every single major era redefines the one before it through massive linguistic collisions, groundbreaking tech innovations, and total ideological repositioning. From the fierce warrior mead halls of the Anglo-Saxons all the way to the fragmented narratives of our modern world, this is fundamentally a history of adaptation. To make sense of this massive journey, here's our roadmap. We're going to follow the structural evolution of the English language through 6 distinct eras. We'll hit the foundations of Old English, conquest in print, the Renaissance, the Romantic Revolution, the Victorian boom, and finally, modernism to postmodernism. So, let's start right at the beginning. Section 1, Foundations of Old English, the Anglo-Saxon Era. We are kicking things off at the very first major milestone in 450 AD, following the migration of Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, over to Britain. Now, keep in mind there is a massive gap of over 600 years between the origins of Old English and our next milestone. And during that time, literature wasn't something you quietly read in a cozy corner. No way. It was a highly communal, oral experience, situated in a fierce warrior culture that was governed by intense loyalty and a deep, deep belief in weird or fate. Because early literature was entirely oral, it relied on some really clever mechanics to help the poet, who was known as a scop, remember the lines. They weren't using rhyme or meter like we see in modern poetry. Instead, they relied heavily on alliterative verse and something called the caesura, which is a distinct rhythmic pause right in the middle of a line. A brilliant example of this oral tech is the kenning, a formulaic metaphorical phrase. So instead of just saying the sea, a poet will call it the whale road. Think of it as an early literary hack. It was incredibly evocative, sure, but it was also a super powerful memory device for a live performer. The anonymous epic Beowulf is the ultimate foundational text of this heroic tradition, and we actually still have the physical artifacts, the preserved, damaged pages of the Noel Codex to prove it. It tells the story of a hero battling monsters like Grendel, and eventually a dragon, but its true contribution to the literary canon is how it synthesizes that old pagan heroic code with a newly emerging Christian morality. It perfectly captures a society caught right between two conflicting worldviews, absolutely obsessed with the transience of life. Let's move forward and see how this builds into something entirely new. Section 2. Conquest, print, and standardization. This is where we hit a profound linguistic rupture. In 1066, the Norman conquest effectively made England a trilingual landscape overnight. You had French for the aristocrats, Latin for the church, and English for the commoners. Eventually, these three collided, heavily simplifying the old Germanic grammar and injecting a massive new vocabulary of French loanwords. When you compare Geoffrey Chaucer's Middle English from the Canterbury Tales right next to its modern translation, you can literally hear the blend of raw Germanic roots and French elegance starting to form the English that we actually recognize today. This linguistic shift completely paved the way for the Chaucerian Revolution. Chaucer established vernacular English as a medium for true high art. But, he wasn't alone in this. William Langland used allegorical dream visions in Piers Plowman to offer up biting social critique. The Pearl poet gave us Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which seamlessly blended that older alliterative style with French chivalric romance. And Sir Thomas Malory compiled the massive Arthurian legends into Le Morte d'Arthur. High literature was suddenly no longer restricted just to Latin scholars. Then, the technology finally caught up with the language. In 1476, William Caxton brought the printing press to England, which essentially ended the Middle Ages. This was a true paradigm shift. By choosing the London dialect to print his books, Caxton literally froze English grammar and spelling in place. He created an authoritative national text. That meant someone up in Yorkshire and someone down in London were finally reading the exact same words. And most importantly, it democratized literacy, breaking the monopoly of the elite and officially birthing the professional writer. With the printing press humming along, we enter Section 3, Renaissance and Enlightenment, moving from the Golden Age to the Republic of Letters. This period kicked off with the Elizabethan Golden Age, which was just an unparalleled explosion of creativity. We see William Shakespeare pushing human psychology and linguistic versatility to their absolute limits on the stage. We've got Ben Jonson's sharp comedy of humors. We have John Donne and the metaphysical poets throwing down wild, paradoxical metaphors called conceits, and it all culminates in John Milton's Paradise Lost in 1667. Milton used majestic blank verse to try and justify the ways of God to men. It's pretty much the absolute pinnacle of the Renaissance epic. But as we know, every action has a reaction. The pendulum swung hard toward the neoclassical period, the Enlightenment. The core philosophies shifted heavily to rationalism and strict decorum. Writers firmly believed literature should instruct and moralize. But they also weaponized brilliant, biting satire. Writers like Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift used sharp wit to ruthlessly expose social folly. And crucially, this new focus on realistic social observation led directly to the birth of the modern novel, with authors prioritizing realistic individual experiences over medieval fantasy. And predictably, all that strict rationalism eventually felt suffocating, leading us to Section 4, the Romantic Revolution, an era completely defined by nature, emotion, and individualism. This whole romantic mindset launched in 1798 when Wordsworth and Coleridge put their foot down and argued that poetry should use the language of men and focus on raw, unfiltered emotion. They were reacting directly against the grim, dehumanizing realities of the brand new Industrial Revolution. Instead, they turned to the awe-inspiring, sometimes terrifying power of nature, a concept they called the sublime. Later generations pushed this even further. Lord Byron gave us the brooding, rebellious, Byronic hero, while authors like Mary Shelley unleashed the Gothic novel with Frankenstein, diving deep into the terror of the unknown and the dark depths of the human subconscious. Which brings us to Section 5, the Victorian boom, an era completely redefined by rapid, unstoppable industrialization. As the 19th century progressed, the machines essentially took over. Literature was suddenly being shaped by literal hardware. The steam printing press made books incredibly cheap to produce, and the massive new railroad network could distribute those texts nationwide overnight. Add in the 1870 Education Act driving up literacy rates among the working class, and you had a massive new audience. Plus, commercial lending libraries demanded books be published in a triple-decker or 3-volume format, just so multiple subscribers could read the same title at once. The market was literally dictating the physical shape of the art. And this brings us to one of the era's most impactful innovations, serialization. Charles Dickens effectively invented this format, publishing his massive novels in cheap weekly or monthly magazine installments. This democratized reading entirely, but it also forced authors to adapt how they wrote. To keep people buying the next issue, writers had to weave massive, complex plots, give characters highly memorable verbal tags, and, of course, invent the cliffhanger. Think of it as the 19th century version of binge-watching a Netflix show. They had to absolutely guarantee you'd come back for the next episode. But relative stability never lasts long, right? Section 6, Modernism to Postmodernism, an era of fragmentation and global voices. The absolute trauma of the First World War completely shattered any lingering faith in Western progress. Neat, orderly, Victorian narratives suddenly felt like lies. So, modernist writers turned their focus completely inward, using a brand new tool, the stream of consciousness. Pioneers like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf just abandoned orderly sentence structures altogether to capture the chaotic, illogical, and highly fragmented flow of actual human thought. Similarly, in poetry, T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land required readers to actively piece together completely disjointed images, directly mirroring the fractured reality of post-war Europe. So how does this build into the late 20th century? Well, while modernists saw fragmentation as a tragic crisis that needed to be solved, postmodernists who emerged after World War II decided to just embrace the chaos. Postmodernism is playful, it's ironic, it loves to use metafiction where the book explicitly knows it's a book, often featuring unreliable narrators to question if objective truth even exists at all. Furthermore, the era finally opened up to diverse global and post-colonial voices, completely rejecting the idea of a single authoritative British narrative. And that brings us to our synthesis. British literature is not just a polite collection of nice stories. It is deeply, inextricably embedded in the material conditions of its time. The Norman Conquest forced a linguistic fusion that literally handed Shakespeare his vocabulary. The printing press built a unified national identity. The Victorian railroads birthed the mass-market novel. And the horrific traumas of the 20th century fractured the narrative entirely. Every major literary movement is a direct, measurable reaction to technological, political, and social upheavals. Which leaves us with a pretty massive question for today. We've seen how oral culture shifted to print, and how print shifted to mass distribution. If British literature is truly a history of adaptation, how will our current digital age, with its algorithms, AI, and instant global communication, redefine the English language next? The dialogue of disruption is far from over. In fact, we're writing the next chapter right now. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the text around you.
Like what you share.
This website makes learning so easy. I found all my resources here.
Noir Plasma Chrome Bleed. Unlocking knowledge, inspiring innovation, empowering curious minds.